I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about a terrific new book by Stuart E. Eizenstat called The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World, we have here with us none other than Ambassador Stu Eizenstat. During a decade and a half of public service in 3 U.S. administrations, Ambassador Eizenstat has held a number of key senior positions, including Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Carter. He was the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, and Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agriculture Affairs. And he was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, all in the Clinton administration. Stu, welcome to The Truth of the Matter, and thanks so much for sharing, this wonderful new book.
Andy, thank you so much for having me, and our long friendship has been greatly appreciated.
Well, it's been certainly appreciated by me. Our listeners know from previous podcasts that Stuart Eizenstat is my mentor, that he took a chance on a young man out of Tulane University and fresh off Capitol Hill working for Senator Johnston, Bennett Johnston from Louisiana. And I came to work for you, Stu, before you went back into the Clinton administration. And it really changed my life in a lot of ways, because one of the things that I worked on with you was your book about the Carter administration, which came out a few years ago. And I had thought I was going to go to law school. Watching you interview people like Zbig Brzezinski and Burt Lance and Tip O'Neill, and I could go on and on, it got me really, I caught the journalism bug and I went to journalism school instead. And here we are.
Well, I'm glad to have helped. You certainly helped me.
Well, I want to ask you about this new book. I mean, the foreword is by Henry Kissinger. There's a note also from James Baker. It is really a masterclass in American diplomacy. What made you decide to take this project on?
So, Andy, I wrote the book for 3 reasons. First, at a turbulent time in our own current history when there are seemingly insoluble problems, I wanted to show how American-led diplomacy over the last 50 years had successfully met previous challenges and could meet those again today. Second, with the hot wars going on in Gaza and Ukraine, the threat of war in Taiwan, and a very mixed record of military involvement by the U.S. from Afghanistan through the Balkan Wars, through the Iraq Wars, through Afghanistan and Libya, I wanted to take a hard look at when and how U.S. military force can be used as a supplement to and an aid to diplomacy. And third, at a time of growing isolationism, similar to what we had between the First and Second World Wars, I wanted to show how important engagement and leadership by the United States in the world is, and that the absence of that, if we lapse into an isolationism, it will leave a vacuum in the world that the Chinas and Indias and Russias will fill with values very different than ours, and will have a much more complicated world than we even have today. So I don't want to give China and Russia the opportunity to fill a vacuum that we might lead. And that is the third reason I wrote the book.
Let's talk about Russia and Ukraine for starters. So this war rages on. There have been a lot of ups and downs for the Ukrainians, but they're holding fast. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of off-ramps to get out of this. So how is there a diplomatic solution possible with this particular hot war?
So Henry Kissinger, who, as you said, wrote the foreword, said to me in one of the 2 interviews I did with him that the outcome on the battlefield determines the course of negotiations at the negotiating table. You can't achieve at the negotiating table what you don't win on the battlefield. And that's one of the reasons why it's so critical that we resupply Ukraine with the most sophisticated weapons as soon as possible. It's one of the reasons why the 6-month congressional delay was so devastating, and why the slow delivery of the Biden administration of F-16s and Abrams tanks and missile systems has impaired Ukraine's counteroffensive. Now, this war will end, and it will end, when both sides realize that they can't achieve more, Andy, on the battlefield in terms of their political aims. And I believe that there will not be a formal peace treaty, that rather there'll be something akin to the 1953 armistice agreement with Korea, in which there's a sort of permanent ceasefire along certain demarcated lines. There it was a demilitarized zone. Now that's held for 70 years. A similar situation is the 1974 Turkish invasion of Cyprus, where again there's been no formal peace agreement. So that means we want to put Ukraine, Andy, in the strongest bargaining position we can so that they can get back as much of their territory as possible, but they're not going to get 100% back. Still, it's a far cry from what Putin envisioned. He's lost half of his Black Sea fleet, 300,000 casualties. And it's important, if we have this kind of armistice agreement, that we not recognize Russia's illegal acquisition of Ukrainian territory and we not relax sanctions. Now, there are a couple of other lessons from my book on that's applicable to Ukraine. One is we cannot and must not negotiate behind President Zelensky's back. We did that twice. We did it in Vietnam. Frankly, Henry Kissinger negotiated the peace agreement with North Korea without South Korea being at the table. And we did it more recently when Secretary of State Pompeo, under President Trump, negotiated, in effect, an end to the war in Afghanistan by negotiating with the Taliban, but not having the Afghan government, for whom we had fought and bled for 20 years, in the room. So it's Zelensky's country. We can give him advice, we can give him encouragement, but in the end, it's his country. And then last, and this is really critical for everyone to understand, this war cannot end successfully in any way unless Ukraine has some security guarantees. There's an old proverb, Andy, that says, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Now, we've been fooled twice by Putin. In 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, he got Ukraine to give up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for express commitments that he would not further invade Ukraine. And yet that's exactly what he did in Crimea. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And then the second time we were fooled is when the United States itself signed, along with Russia and Ukraine and the UK, something called the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements in 2014 and 15 to end the fighting in the Donbass area. Well, what happened? 7 years later, Putin publicly said the Minsk agreements are no more. They don't exist anymore. And 3 days later, he invaded. Well, Zelensky's going to say, well, wait a minute, you want me to come to the peace table? How do I know that we just won't have a situation where Putin rests, reloads, and starts all over again? So what can we do to try to create something probably short of an Article 5 NATO agreement? Well, one is almost immediate membership in the European Union, to which I was ambassador. It will be very difficult for Putin to invade a European Union country. Second, to have the kind of security agreements that President Biden just reached at the G7, a 10-year agreement, get more countries to do that so that we are saying to Putin, we're going to supply Zelensky and Ukraine with military arms on a continuing basis so they're strong enough to resist any further aggression. And then third, perhaps putting NATO trainers, there are already 150 in the country, in Ukraine. So this issue of getting a sufficient guarantee, perhaps short of a Article 5 NATO guarantee, will be very critical.
Stu, in Dr. Kissinger's foreword, basically the first line of it is, and I quote, in conduct of foreign policy, a society faces an inherent conflict with its domestic policy. You alluded to that in the 6-month issue of holding up arms to Ukraine. How important is this maxim from Dr. Kissinger?
It's really important. And in my interview with Tony Blinken, he made the point that we are only as strong abroad as we are strong at home, strong militarily, strong politically, strong economically, and united. It's very difficult for even the best negotiator to negotiate on behalf of the United States if the opponent sees that domestically he's standing on quicksand and he doesn't have a united front. So we need to do the maximum we can on foreign policy to end some of these awful partisan divisions so that our negotiators, whether Republican or Democrat, have the backing of Congress and the backing of the public.
Stu, I grew up in this town where foreign policy was usually bipartisan. Here at CSIS, we've built an entire organization around that. When you were in office in the Carter administration, certain elements of foreign policy held over to the Reagan administration, namely the SALT II, I believe it was,
Exactly.
that Reagan upheld. There's been countless other bipartisan efforts in terms of the Middle East, in terms of Asia. How important is bipartisanship these days? And it feels very elusive because, you know, almost everything is a partisan fight.
That's right. And, I was at a U.S. Capitol commemoration for Yom HaShoah, for Holocaust Memorial Day, at which I spoke and introduced President Biden. But Mike Johnson, the Republican speaker, was there and spoke, and Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, spoke. And after the ceremony, Mike Johnson came by, and I said to him, Mr. Speaker, although it took 6 months, if John Kennedy was writing a new chapter in his Profiles in Courage, you would be in it because you were willing to take on your right-wing caucus and do the right thing in terms of foreign policy. We need more of that. And I think that there is that. Yes, there is going to be the Freedom Caucus on the right. There'll be some people on the far left. But I really believe that there is an opportunity because, Andy, the threats from Russia, the threats from China are so evident. And this latest trip of Putin to North Korea just reinforces that I hope it shakes people up to realize we, at least on foreign policy, need to come together and back whoever the president is and taking a firm stand against Russian aggression, against Chinese aggression, and projecting American influence and power and diplomatic means.
Stu, I want to ask you about trade for a second. You have some really interesting analysis in here, including talking about Bob Lighthizer, the excellent USTR during the Trump administration. What lessons does Ambassador Lighthizer have? And do you think our trade is at a point where it can become, again, a bipartisan effort?
Well, trade has taken a decidedly protectionist turn for both the Democratic and Republican parties, which I think is really a shame. I mean, there hasn't been one major new trade agreement in this administration. So that I think is a problem because opening our market to other goods helps our consumers, but it also helps our foreign policy. It greases the wheel for other agreements. So bipartisanship is tremendously important. And in fact, I'm doing an event tonight with Carla Hills, who was George H.W. Bush's trade representative.
And a CSIS trustee.
Yes, and a CSIS trustee. So I think that bipartisanship is very important, but there is no international negotiation that's more tinged with domestic politics because you're dealing with jobs, you're dealing with keeping factories open, you're dealing with competition from countries that are dumping goods like China and that have unfair trade practices. So international trade negotiations are really important. Now, one of the messages, one of the lessons that I have 14 of them that I mentioned of common skills that good negotiators have. One of them, Bob Lighthizer, President Trump's trade negotiator, was very skilled, was what he called preparation, preparation, and preparation. That is, when you go into a negotiation, you have to be supremely prepared to know all the issues, not just on your side, but on the other side. How are they thinking? You need to put yourself in their shoes. You need to be a good listener. You can only forge compromises if you understand the issues well enough to know how far you can push the other side. I mean, diplomacy on the international stage is not a poker game where it's a winner take all situation. It has to be a win-win situation. And you have to be, that's why I call it the art of diplomacy. You have to be like an artist painting on an easel. You have to be creative and you have to get the other side to believe that it's in their interest to do what's in America's interest. And that can only be done, as Bob Lighthizer said, and others that I interviewed, if you're supremely prepared.
You talk about this a lot in the book through the case studies, but who, in your view, are the greatest American diplomats?
Well, I think that there are several. First, Henry Kissinger, obviously, along with Jim Baker, are at the very top, along with President Carter. And let me explain. Henry Kissinger, both in the opening to China and in the 1973 post-Yom Kippur War disengagement, was able to persuade both Golda Meir and Anwar Sadat to reach a compromise on a disengagement agreement. Very difficult, and to do an opening to China. Second, Jim Baker was able to get all of our very wary World War II allies, the British, the French, and the Soviets, to agree after the collapse of the Berlin Wall that East and West Germany should be reunited in NATO. Now, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, was very wary, as were the French and the Soviets, of a strong reunited Germany because of World War I and World War II. She joked, quoting a French aphorism, "I love Germany so much, I want two of them." So Jim Baker showed supreme negotiating skills. And one of the ways he did it, Andy, was developing a personal relationship, a truly personal relationship with Shevardnadze, the foreign minister. And now, how did he do that? He got away from the formal negotiating table and he took him on a several-day trip to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where he had a retreat. And that broke down the ice. It established a personal relationship where they talked about peace for their children and peace for their grandchildren. And it enabled Shevardnadze to break from the orthodoxy of his own foreign ministry and reach an agreement. And third is Jimmy Carter. Now, his negotiation at Camp David is, in my opinion, the greatest presidential exercise in diplomacy. You know, normally presidents come in at the end of negotiations and sign on the dotted line. He personally negotiated 20 separate drafts over 13 days and nights at Camp David, realizing what each side needed. And then one of the things that I mentioned again as a skill is on the preparation side. He had studied the CIA profiles of Sadat and Begin. And the 13th and last day, when it looked it was going to all collapse, because Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, came to President Carter's cabin at Camp David and said, "Mr. President, I've made all the compromises I can. I cannot make any more. Get a limousine for me. I want to go back to Andrews Air Force Base. I've already got an Al Al plane." Well, the president realized if that happened, Sadat's historic and courageous trip to Jerusalem would be vitiated. He'd come back empty-handed. He could be assassinated. It might be the collapse of the president's own administration. So remembering what the profile of Begin said, and that was that he had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. The president had 8 copies of the original photo of the 3 leaders, Sadat, Begin, and Carter, on the first day made, and then personally autographed it to each individual grandchild, walked over to Begin's cabin, handed it to him, and as he vocalized what the president said, which was best wishes for peace, Jimmy Carter, he could see Begin's eyes begin to tear, his lips quiver. He put his bag down and he said, "I'll make one last try." And that ended up doing it. So it's that preparation, that determination is critical. One last person that would be in this pantheon for me would be George Mitchell in the Good Friday Agreement. He negotiated this for several years, and here you had, Andy, an intense opposition. The British, in typical British understatement, called the Civil War between the Catholics and Protestants, the Nationalists and Unionists, the Troubles. Well, I mean, the Troubles caused 3,500 deaths and over 10,000 people maimed. And through remarkably patient and skilled negotiations and very creative negotiations, I use again the term art because you have to be creative. There's always going to be an impasse. Well, here the impasse that Mitchell faced was that these political parties had their own armed militias. And they distrusted each other so much that actually during the negotiations, Andy, they were killing each other. And so the demand was disarm. How can we negotiate without that? And he knew he couldn't get that done because there was such distrust. So he creatively came up with something called the Mitchell Principles, which were, yes, you can keep your arms, but you have to sign an agreement that while we negotiate, that your goal is to achieve a peaceful, nonviolent solution to the problem. So it's that kind of creativity which George Mitchell brought to the table, and that's why he would be in my top four listing.
These are fascinating examples. I want to turn to Israel and Gaza. In your chapter on the Middle East, you end with Israel and Hamas, and you say even the most skilled American diplomacy has been unable to bridge the competing national claims by Israelis and Palestinians to the same land. That certainly is the case. What do you make of the situation in Israel right now with Hamas? And then I also want to ask you about, what may be coming next with Hezbollah.
Yes. So let's remember that there were peace agreements outstanding with Egypt, with Jordan, with the UAE under President Trump, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and they were close to being concluded in the Biden administration with Saudi Arabia when Hamas invaded on October 7, and that's one of the reasons they did. Now, let me start with the following proposition, and that is that no sovereign state, including Israel, can accept a radical government on its border overtly committed to its destruction. So Hamas has to be disabled as a governing and military force. And both Prime Minister Netanyahu in the last 24 hours and his top military aides are saying that they are now in a so-called phase 3 or phase C, in which the fighting is going to wind down. They are basically, I think, disrupted the coordinated military capacity of Hamas. But that doesn't mean that Hamas is going to end. Indeed, their own military spokesman, Admiral Hagari, said, "We cannot totally defeat Hamas. It's an idea." So what do we have to do? I think what's really critical now and what was lacking, you have to have three things for a successful military operation: good intelligence, decisive force, and a political plan in advance before you shoot the first bullet. Well, Israeli intelligence, their vaunted Mossad intelligence, really failed. And indeed, the head of the Mossad has resigned. What they missed was they thought they could domesticate Hamas by allowing 18,000 workers into Israel, by allowing the Qataris to fund them. And that turned out not to be the case. Dennis Ross and I chair a think tank in Israel, and several leading generals told us that the mistake we, the Israeli intelligence and military, made was right before our eyes, but without our seeing it. We, the Israelis, permitted Hamas, Andy, to morph from a terrorist group, which would occasionally send terrorist fighters into Israel, but in ones and twos, into a full-blown terrorist army of 30 to 40,000 well-trained, well-armed, well-disciplined military buried in 300 miles of tunnels, some as deep as 80 meters. So the intelligence was lacking. Second, there was no, and there still is no, as we speak right now, Andy, there is no post-war plan. How can the IDF, the Israeli military, pull out if there's no security substitute, if there's no governance? How do you rebuild Gaza? How do you provide for humanitarian needs if there's no government, if there's no multinational force? So the Biden plan is a very good plan to answer those questions, but it depends on the following. Israel's real security is to put Gaza in a broader context, Andy. That is, to put it in the context that its greatest threat is Iran and its proxies, the Syrians, the Iranian militias in Iraq, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there is such a coalition that Israel can be embedded in to its real security that's there for the taking, with all the moderate Sunni countries with whom they already reached an agreement, and the Saudis. But the cost of that is going to be some political perspective, doesn't have to be tomorrow, on an eventual Palestinian sovereignty. Now, the Israeli public is right now opposed to that, as is obviously the government, because they worry that any Palestinian state will become a radical state. So you have to have confidence building measures in the meantime. But without that perspective, Israel will not have the capacity to be embedded in this, and they'll be tied down in Gaza for a long time, which they do not want. Neither right nor left wants to have a permanent occupation. And then one last point that I'd really like to make. I went to Columbia University before the second night of Passover with my son. We got in because there was a professor of journalism there who led us into what was sort of an armed camp. And I wish I could have said to these demonstrators the following. Look at how many times the Palestinians had the opportunity to make peace, to have their own state, and lost it. The Peel Commission in 1937, the UN resolution in 1947, at Camp David, where we couldn't get the PLO to come to Camp David because they wouldn't accept UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. The 2000 summit, Camp David II, with Prime Minister Barak and Bill Clinton and Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Authority at the time, where they were offered 95% of the West Bank back, East Jerusalem as a capital, making up the other 5% with Israeli land in the Sinai, rejected. 2009, under Prime Minister Olmert and this Palestinian President Abbas, 96% of the West Bank back. And not only that, East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 Palestinians coming back into Israel for family reunion. Rejected. And then in 2005, Prime Minister Sharon, a hard-nosed hawk, decides they can't stay in Gaza. They withdraw every single soldier. They forcibly withdraw. I wish we could show the videos to these kids on all these campuses. Forcibly removed 7,000 Israeli settlers and left the whole infrastructure, greenhouses and so forth, for the Palestinians to take over. Well, Hamas won the next election and then sent Israel rockets instead of roses. Now, let me give you one example of what could happen. And this is a personal example. July of 2000, when I was Deputy Treasury Secretary, I was in charge of the economic part of the peace process, and I went to Gaza. And we had gotten Congress to pass something called qualifying industrial zone legislation, which allowed industrial zones in any Arab country that had peace with Israel, so Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority. And they could ship back their goods duty free if they had as little, Andy, as 10% Israeli content. And what I saw in July of 2000 in Gaza was absolutely beautiful. 30 plants, not Israeli plants, Japanese plants, other Asian countries, European, American plants using small amounts of Israeli content and shipping back. And I went into one of the plants and I saw the products made by the Palestinians, 1,200 Palestinians employed in these 30 plants. I saw them loaded onto a flatbed truck, go through the Eretz crossing to the airport that the Corps of Engineers, we got them to build for the Palestinians for direct export. We had the unemployment rate down to 14% there and 8% in the West Bank. There was only one unarmed Israeli soldier, unarmed. So that's what could have been. But then at Camp David, not long afterward, it collapsed. The second intifada started, and then we were back in the cycle again.
It's so tragic. And, speaking of the demonstrations on campus, it feels like there's more anti-Semitism going on right now in the world, and particularly here in the United States, than there has been in any time, at least in my lifetime. How does this end? How does it get better?
Well, first, the anti-Semitism is extremely concerning. I'm chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and one of the things we're trying to do now is begin to use social media because that's where young people get their news, TikTok and Instagram and so forth.
Right. The Pew study in 2022 showed that they get their news just as much from those sources as they do from traditional news
Even
sources.
more so. And
Yeah.
so, one of the things we're trying to do is when there's Holocaust distortion and disinformation and denial and anti Semitic tropes, we try immediately to put on social media corrective, accurate information. Now, I think that this will diminish some when the Gaza war unfurls and some of the more intense fighting ends. But one of the things that may happen, and it'll be for me, as Yogi Berra would say, deja vu all over again. I was, after a year in the Johnson White House following Harvard Law School, I worked in the Humphrey campaign in the 1968 presidential race against Richard Nixon. And I was in Chicago for that disastrous anti-Vietnam protest with Mayor Daley's dogs and tear gas. And I fear we're going to see a repeat in Chicago in the summer of this year by these same kids, some students and some non-students who have been on the college campuses. So it's very important from a multiple perspective to find a diplomatic and political solution. But again, that is going to have to involve something for the Palestinians.
Unfortunately, the isolation that you've talked about in this book and in your remarks here today, Israel seems more isolated than it ever has been through this conflict. And I'm hearing policymakers and senior people around town say, maybe we should just give up on this and leave it to the Palestinians and the Israelis because this is impossible. What do you say to those people?
I mean, that would be a disaster. It's the very isolationist tendency that says, let's leave the world to others. Anytime you have a vacuum, somebody's going to fill it. It'll be filled by the worst forces. So, as difficult as that is, we have to continue to be engaged. If we did that, it would be a devastating signal to not only Israel, but to our Arab allies that we are disengaging. We don't care about the region anymore. Well, the Russians and the Chinese would love that.
And a lot of people think that the Russians and the Chinese are the ones stoking up the misinformation on social media in the first place to get the world against Israel.
Well, they certainly are participating in it, that's for sure. Yes. But Iran is also.
Yes. Have you ever felt like in the last 40 years Israel's been this isolated?
No, This is unique. You have the International Criminal Court, you know, talking about arrest warrants. You have three European Union countries that, in the midst of this fighting, initiated by the brutality of Hamas, unilaterally recognizing a Palestinian state with no negotiations, no conditions, no requirements to end the fighting. And uh, so I think that Israel is isolated. Thankfully, the United States has stood behind Israel. Most of the European countries have stood behind Israel. But this is fraying too. Certainly, the left in the United States is a problem. And even within my own party, some 55 members of the House Democratic Caucus signed a letter asking the president to withhold U.S. military assistance to Israel at the very time it's fighting for its life.
We're coming up on an issue with Hezbollah in a major way for Israel. It seems like there's going to be more than just shooting any day now. It seems like there could be some kind of real kinetic action there. Israel is going to need the support of the United States more than ever. What do you think the United States will do if Iran's proxies Hezbollah, terrorist organization, by all measures, comes after Israel in an even harder way than they are right now?
Right now, some 80,000 Israelis in northern Israel have been displaced, something that gets almost no news.
Which is an awful lot of people when you're talking about a country of 8 million people.
Absolutely. So this is a terrible problem. And Iran is fomenting Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas, much stronger. It has maybe 10 times the number of men and missiles than Hamas has. Now, I believe that neither Israel nor Hezbollah wants a full scale war. And indeed, the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, has said when the fighting in Gaza ends, we will have no further reason to attack Israel. So the solution to Lebanon goes through Gaza also. The possibility of miscalculation is certainly there, but I think that it would be a mistake to have a full blown war there. And I think that if the fighting in Gaza really does tamp down, and I think it will very shortly, I'm hopeful that Hezbollah will do likewise.
I had retired Lieutenant General Asaf Orion on this podcast pretty recently, and he, of course, is an Israeli general who's an expert with Hezbollah. He was not very optimistic that Israel's going to get out of this without a pretty serious fight. Will the international community condemn Hezbollah if they come after Israel harder than they are right now, and it leads to a full-scale war?
I hope so because there the aggression will be so obvious. There have been efforts to get the Hezbollah troops to go north of what's called the Litani River so that they're less danger from their missiles than they are now being closer to the border. And we have a very good U.S. negotiator, Amos Hochstein, who actually negotiated a maritime agreement between Lebanon and Israel. I think what's different now from previous wars is Hezbollah now is part of the political fabric of Lebanon. And it realizes that if it goes too far, that its political standing will be diminished because people will say in Lebanon, as they're already saying, you're getting us into a war we don't want.
And the last time Hezbollah really engaged with Israel in a serious way, Israel knocked them back several years. It seems, though, in those years since, the amount of tunnels has increased in southern Lebanon. The amount of missiles and big stuff that they actually have to deploy against Israel has increased. How grave of a threat are they to Israel?
They are a grave threat. Again, as I mentioned, they're 10 times larger than Hamas. They have 10 times more arms and missiles. And Iran has every reason to try to really stoke disruption. But again, I believe at the end of the day, because of the damage they suffered in previous wars and the fact that they're now part of the political fabric, that we're not likely to see a full-blown Lebanese war. And the other reason is that the Israeli military is really depleted from the 9 months of fighting in Gaza, and its capability of fighting a full-blown war in the north is somewhat compromised as well.
Stu, I want to end with a lower simmering conflict, and you mentioned it's Taiwan. Um, Taiwan is a flashpoint that is in the news sometimes, but overlooked because of Ukraine and Gaza. It's constantly on the minds of policymakers who deal with Asia policy. We talk about it all the time here at CSIS. What's your assessment of the situation with Taiwan? We keep hearing, the Chinese are antsy, but maybe the Chinese are patient. We've done some wargaming here at CSIS that shows that neither side would win in such a conflict. Where do you see that playing out?
Well, first of all, when Henry Kissinger and Nixon negotiated the Shanghai Communique in 1972, they used one of the lessons that I draw in my book, and that is sometimes to overcome impasses, like over Taiwan, you need to use ambiguous language. And so the language that was used for Taiwan was ambiguous, in effect, that both sides recognize there's only one China without suggesting which one it was. So in the Shanghai Communique, there was a commitment by China and the United States, and that was that this issue of Taiwan would be peacefully resolved. China agreed to that. Now, we can't depend on them following it. That's why what happens in Ukraine is important. Are we going to really back up Zelensky or pull the rug out from under him? They're watching. Second, we need, as we have been doing, to arm Taiwan so that any invasion that's done cross-channel will be as painful as possible. And I'm hopeful that that, plus strengthening the relationship with South Korea and Japan and the United States, together with Taiwan, will send a signal of resolve. Now the Philippines are also becoming much more pro-American, so that China needs to realize that the costs of an invasion are simply too high to risk.
Stu, this is a wonderful book. I'm sure it's going to be taught in at the Kennedy School, many other Georgetown, etc., many other great sites. You interviewed well over 130 people for this,
Yes.
senior people. As we end, just tell me, who were your three favorite interviews that you did?
Well, I think first, the interview, interestingly, was Steve Hadley, who
Yeah.
was the National Security Advisor to George W. Bush. And the reason I say that is he was very, very candid and recognizing the mistakes that they made, including not picking up the fact that Saddam had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction, and also not having, before they intervened, a post war plan. Second is the Kissinger, and third is the Baker interviews. They were just terrific. And the ability to get Kissinger, then in his 90s, but still extremely sharp, to talk about his philosophy of negotiating, to hear how Jim Baker was able to pull off German reunification was really very exciting.
When I saw that you had written this book and the people you interviewed, I couldn't help but think of our late colleague here at CSIS, Dr. Zbig Brzezinski, your close friend and former colleague in the Carter administration. How great would it have been to interview him for this?
I wish I could have, but Zbig's influence is in this book. I certainly, of course, worked with him. In my book on President Carter, I went into some detail about what he had accomplished, including, by the way, the normalization with China. That was done by Zbig. And so he's very much a presence in this book.
Well, Stu, I can't thank you enough. The title of this podcast, The Truth of the Matter, wouldn't even be possible without you because as a young research assistant, I read Bert Lance's book, The Truth of the Matter, and that's where I took it from. So I thank you so much for all of your help in my life and your guidance and your amazing work and service on behalf of this country. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Angie, and good luck.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog